Gaza's hunger crisis, 5 die of malnutrition in 24 hours. Imagine the stark reality. 5 lives lost to malnutrition in Gaza within just 24 hours. This grim statistic, reported by the Gaza Ministry of Health, underscores the dire humanitarian crisis unfolding in the Hamas-controlled territory. All 5 individuals who succumbed to malnutrition were adults, highlighting the widespread and devastating impact of the ongoing conflict. Since the conflict began nearly 2 years ago, a total of 180 people, including 93 children, have perished due to hunger. This is a tragedy that demands urgent attention and action. But here's where it gets controversial. The international community is increasingly pressuring Israel to facilitate more aid into Gaza, a region ravaged by nearly 2 years of conflict between the Israel Defense Forces, IDF, and Palestinian militant groups, with Hamas being the most prominent. The UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer has announced that the UK will recognize a Palestinian state at a United Nations meeting in September if Israel does not agree to a ceasefire in Gaza. This move follows a similar announcement by French President Emmanuel Macron, who stated that France will acknowledge Palestine as a state regardless of a ceasefire at the same meeting. Aid is slowly trickling back into Gaza after Israel imposed an 11-week total blockade on all humanitarian supplies earlier this year. This blockade led to widespread malnutrition and conditions that could likely result in famine, according to the UN and aid groups. Israeli officials have long accused Hamas of stealing and reselling aid, a claim that Hamas vehemently denies. In a recent post on X, Israel asserted that it has been working tirelessly to get food, medicine, and essentials into Gaza. However, the UN World Food Programme reported that only about half of its requested 100 trucks have been allowed into Gaza by Israel. Last week, ABC News' Ian Pannell visited an aid station in Gaza that had stacks of undelivered food. An IDF spokesperson stated that it is the international community's responsibility to deliver it, but the UN countered that it cannot do so safely. The Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, a global initiative monitoring hunger with the backing of governments, the UN, and non-governmental organizations, warned last week that the worst-case scenario of famine is unfolding in Gaza. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, however, has vehemently denied these claims, stating that the idea of Israel applying a campaign of starvation in Gaza is a bold-faced lie. He insists that there is no policy of starvation in Gaza and that there is no starvation in Gaza. Aid distribution in Gaza is being conducted via sites run by the U.S. and Israel-backed Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which started operating in Gaza in late May. Israel insists that aid distribution must go through GHF to prevent Hamas from seizing aid. In recent weeks, the Israeli government has allowed certain countries to start airdropping aid into Gaza. However, Philippe Lazzarini, Commissioner General of UNRWA, the largest UN agency operating in Gaza, warned in a July 26 post on X that airdrops are the most expensive and inefficient way to deliver aid, calling them a distraction to the inaction. But aid operations have been hampered by the killings of nearly 1,400 Palestinians who were trying to receive food aid, according to UN figures. After previous such incidents, the IDF has said that its troops only fire warning shots at crowds and when its personnel feel they are in danger. The IDF and GHF have also previously accused Hamas of instigating violence at or close to aid distribution points. Human Rights Watch on Friday accused Israel of committing war crimes and violations of international law, citing the killings of people near food aid distribution sites in Gaza, as well as deprivation of food, aid, and other basic services. In its response, the IDF accused Hamas of starving and endangering the population in order to maintain control over the Strip and of taking actions to prevent the success of food distribution in Gaza. Before USAID officially ceased independent operations in July, an analysis compiled by its officials said it failed to find any evidence that Hamas engaged in widespread diversion of assistance. Israel also said it allows the GHF to operate independently in the distribution of aid and that troops operate in proximity to make sure food is delivered in an orderly fashion. And this is the part most people miss. The humanitarian crisis in Gaza is a complex issue with no easy solutions. But one thing is clear: the lives of innocent people are at stake, and urgent action is needed. So, what do you think? Should the international community do more to pressure Israel and Hamas to find the resolution? Or is the situation too complex for simple solutions? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Why airdrops aren't the solution for Gaza's humanitarian crisis. Leading U.S. foreign disaster assistance has given we a unique perspective on the complexities of humanitarian aid, particularly in crisis situations like Gaza. The idea of delivering emergency food supplies via airdrops is not only impractical, but also fraught with numerous challenges, as highlighted in the July 27th article titled "In Frayed Gaza, Aid Airdrops Take Hold." My experience in this field allows me to assert that such operations are not only inefficient, but also incredibly expensive and perilous. Airdropping supplies from aircraft is arguably the least equitable method of distributing humanitarian aid. History has shown us, especially in conflict zones, that it is often the young, the physically fit, and those with weapons who manage to seize these supplies first. This means that vulnerable populations, such as children, the elderly, the injured, and those in schools and hospitals, are left without the necessary resources they desperately need. Without a dedicated team of relief workers on the ground to ensure that food and supplies reach those who need them most, the risk of aid being diverted to militant groups increases significantly, which is precisely what Israel fears the most. In a comprehensive study on airdrops that I co-authored at the Institute for Defense Analyses, we identified a key takeaway. While airdrops may provide a temporary sense of satisfaction to donor nations, the exorbitant costs and operational inefficiencies often serve as a catalyst for getting traditional aid trucks back on the road. This is a crucial point that many overlook. Jim Kunder, Alexandria, the author, previously served as the Deputy Administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development. Shifting gears, let's discuss the recent developments in British politics regarding the recognition of a Palestinian state. The July 30th article, "Starmer vows to recognize Palestinian state unless Israel shifts Gaza policy," raises significant concerns about the direction of the Labour Party under Prime Minister Keir Starmer. Starmer's assertion that Britain might recognize a Palestinian state without considering Israel's security needs or the entrenched terrorist networks in Gaza and the West Bank is alarming. This approach does not reflect true diplomacy. Rather, it suggests that aggression and obstinacy are rewarded on the global stage. This proposed recognition comes at a time when Hamas continues to operate within civilian areas, taking hostages and rearming with support from Iran. Starmer has not provided any criteria for what a recognized Palestinian state would entail, nor has he addressed the legitimacy issues surrounding the Palestinian Authority, which lacks democratic accountability and control. Given Britain's historical context, one would expect a more nuanced approach that acknowledges the dangers of appeasing aggressors while undermining allies. Starmer's stance disregards Israel's security concerns and undermines decades of international consensus that any resolution to this conflict must be achieved through negotiation rather than imposition. Britain should advocate for peace that is grounded in realism and mutual recognition. Stephen M. Flatto. New York, the writer is the president of the Religious Zionists of America, Mizrachi. Now, let's turn our attention to the pressing issue of literacy in America. In his July 30th opinion piece, "There is no reading crisis in the U.S. Here's what's really happening," Paul Thomas made a significant misstep by downplaying the severity of America's reading crisis and criticizing the National Assessment of Educational Progress, NAEP, for setting its standards too high. Having served on the National Assessment Governing Board during the establishment of these standards in the early 1990s, I can attest that we created 3 benchmarks: basic, proficient, and advanced, for every testing cycle in subjects tracked by NAEP, including reading and math, which Congress mandates every 2 years for 4th and 8th graders. We designated proficient as the standard that every young American should strive to achieve. It's important to note that this was intended as an aspirational goal, not merely a reflection of what is commonly understood as grade level. The term grade level can vary widely and typically represents a minimum passing threshold, rather than an ideal level of student learning. While Thomas is correct that in many instances, grade level aligns more closely with NAEP's basic level rather than proficient, this is precisely the issue. Aiming for grade level is setting the bar too low for our children. Students who reach the NAE proficient level have demonstrated a solid understanding of challenging material, showcasing their subject knowledge, the ability to apply that knowledge in real-world contexts, and their analytical skills. Isn't that the kind of outcome we should desire for our children? Using this standard, we are indeed facing a literacy crisis. According to the spring 2022 data, only 33% of 4th graders were proficient readers, a decline from 35% in 2019, and just 31% of 8th graders achieved proficiency, down from 34% in the same period. I would label this a literacy catastrophe. Thomas is mistaken in his attempt to lower the nation's expectations. Chester E. Finn, Jr., Washington. The writer is the President Emeritus and a distinguished senior fellow at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. In his commentary on July 30th, Paul Thomas made a critical error by downplaying the existence of a reading crisis in America. This misjudgment is deeply rooted in a historical pattern of minimizing systemic inequities by questioning the data that highlights them. For decades, our nation has overlooked, selectively reported, or manipulated data to deny the existence of crises that disproportionately affect marginalized communities. The delayed acknowledgement of the AIDS epidemic, the underreporting of police brutality, and the discrediting of data revealing hazardous lead levels in Flint, Michigan all exemplify a troubling trend. When data indicates that systems are failing the most vulnerable, the response is often to discredit the metrics. We cannot afford to repeat this. We can debate whether the proficiency bar is set too high, but the data is clear. Fewer students are receiving the necessary support to meet that standard today than they did a decade ago, particularly among students of color. The silver lining is that we have a wealth of knowledge about effective strategies. Thomas rightly pointed out the need to focus on opportunity gaps, and he is correct that grade retention is not the solution. However, rather than seeking the perfect assessment, we must utilize the best data available to advocate for comprehensive and sustainable changes that ensure all schools are equipped with the resources needed to implement rigorous, diverse materials and evidence-based instructional practices to teach every child how to read. Allison Rose Sokol, Silver Spring. The writer is the Vice President of P12 Policy, Practice and Research at EdTrust. While Paul Thomas correctly noted that the proficiency standard on the National Assessment of Educational Progress is set higher than the grade-level standard on state tests, it's important to recognize that state standards can be easily manipulated. This is why the NAEP is regarded as a far more reliable measure of reading ability, regardless of where the bar is set. Even if we consider the NAEP's basic measure as the appropriate standard, the fact that 1/3 of all students fall below that threshold constitutes a reading crisis, especially since we have made no progress in reducing that percentage over the past several decades. Moreover, this 1/3 figure represents an overall average. Among 8th graders whose parents have no college education, 44% score below basic, and 52% of 4th graders from families qualifying for free or reduced lunch fall into the same category. Thomas referenced a study to argue that grade retention yields only short-term benefits on state reading test scores. However, the study found that the positive effects of any early literacy policy tend to diminish by middle school. One likely reason for this is that elementary schools often focus solely on phonics and reading comprehension skills, neglecting to build the knowledge students need to comprehend the texts they encounter in higher grades. This narrow focus also contributes to the disparity in reading test scores between students from different socioeconomic backgrounds. Children from more educated families are likely gaining academic knowledge at home, which enhances their comprehension abilities. While phonics is essential for narrowing test score gaps, addressing the nation's reading crisis and leveling the playing field requires all schools to adopt content-rich, knowledge-building curricula starting in early elementary grades. Natalie Wexler, Washington Now. Let's address a concerning trend in how history is being portrayed. I was both disheartened and unsurprised to read the July 26 article titled, "National Park Service is Enlisted to Fight Corrosive Ideology." This piece revealed that the National Park Service is reviewing the books sold in its gift shops, considering the removal of those that contradict Trump-approved narratives. Among the flag titles is one that refers to George Washington as an enslaver. Another book, Wives, Slaves, and Servant Girls, Advertisements for Female Runaways in American Newspapers 1770 to 1783, was also marked for potential removal, with the Park Service citing an abundance of caution. Caution? What is the threat in confronting the realities of our nation's history? The fact remains that Washington was indeed an enslaver. A shameful truth that he owned human beings. He also established a precedent for future presidents to peacefully transfer power. History encompasses both triumphs and failures, and it is essential to acknowledge it in its entirety. The attempts by the Trump administration to sanitize history are perilous. One must wonder how future historians will interpret not only Trump's actions, but also the responses of those who failed to resist his directives. Tragic hunger crisis in Gaza, lives lost seeking aid. In the heart of the ongoing Gaza crisis, the situation has reached a tragic nadir, with more lives lost and basic necessities becoming increasingly scarce. This is a stark reminder of the devastating impact of prolonged conflict on innocent civilians. But here's where it gets controversial. The root causes of this crisis and the effectiveness of current interventions remain hotly debated. On Monday, August 4, 2025, health authorities reported that at least 40 Palestinians lost their lives due to Israeli gunfire and airstrikes in Gaza. Among them were 10 individuals who were tragically killed while attempting to seek aid. This heartbreaking statistic underscores the dire risks Palestinians face simply by reaching out for assistance. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, GHF, supported by the United States, has been providing critical aid to the region since May 2025. However, local medics report that at least 10 casualties occurred near GHF sites on Monday. The UN has documented over 1,000 deaths of Palestinians while attempting to receive aid since the GHF began operations, with the majority being targeted by Israeli forces. The situation at Gaza City's Al-Shifa hospital is particularly poignant. Bilal Thari, a 40-year-old man, shared his grim observations. Everyone who goes there comes back either with a bag of flour or carried back on a wooden stretcher as a martyr, or injured. No one comes back safe. This vivid description paints a harrowing picture of the daily struggles faced by residents. Adding to the tragedy, at least 13 Palestinians were killed on Sunday while waiting for UN aid trucks to arrive at the Zakim crossing on the Israeli border. The scarcity of white burial shrouds, which hold significant religious importance in Islamic traditions, is also alarming, due to ongoing Israeli border restrictions and the high number of daily deaths. Many bodies were wrapped in blankets instead. Thari's words resonate deeply. We don't want war. We want peace. We want this misery to end. We are out on the streets. We all are hungry. We are all in bad shape. Women are out there on the streets. We have nothing available for us to live a normal life like all human beings. There's no life. His sentiments echo the widespread desperation felt by Gazans. Israel has responded to criticism by claiming that Hamas is responsible for the suffering in Gaza. The Israeli military has taken steps to facilitate more aid, such as pausing fighting for parts of the day in certain areas, allowing airdrops, and establishing protected routes for aid convoys. However, these measures have been met with skepticism by many observers. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu announced plans to convene his security cabinet to discuss how the military should proceed in Gaza to achieve his government's war goals, which include defeating Hamas and freeing hostages. But this approach raises questions about the balance between military objectives and humanitarian considerations. The crisis extends beyond the immediate threat of violence. 5 more people died from starvation or malnutrition on Monday, bringing the total number of hunger-related deaths since the war began to 180, including 93 children. UN agencies argue that airdrops of food are inadequate and that Israel must significantly increase land-based aid deliveries. Despite Israel's claims of easing restrictions, the reality on the ground remains challenging. According to the Israeli Coordination of Government Activities in the Territories, COGAT, over 23,000 tons of humanitarian aid in 1,200 trucks entered Gaza in the previous week. However, many of these trucks have yet to reach aid distribution centers due to logistical challenges and security concerns. Witnesses and Hamas sources report that many aid trucks have been looted by desperate civilians and armed groups, further exacerbating the crisis. Palestinian and UN officials estimate that Gaza requires approximately 600 aid trucks per day to meet humanitarian needs, a figure that aligns with pre-war levels of aid access. The Gaza conflict erupted on October 7, 2023, when Hamas launched an attack on southern Israel, killing 1,200 people and taking 251 hostages. Since then, Gaza health officials report that over 60,000 Palestinians have lost their lives, with no distinction made between combatants and non-combatants. According to Israeli officials, 50 hostages remain in Gaza, with only 20 believed to be alive. The fate of these individuals continues to be a source of international concern and debate. This crisis highlights the complex interplay of military strategy, humanitarian aid, and political will in resolving conflicts. As the situation evolves, it is crucial to consider the broader implications for civilian populations and the path toward sustainable peace. What do you think? Is there a better way to address the humanitarian crisis in Gaza? Should military actions take precedence over aid delivery, or vice versa? Share your thoughts in the comments below.